The greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance. It is the illusion of knowledge. That quote from Daniel J. Boorstin feels particularly relevant for our deep dive today. We're going to unpack a really significant piece from the Indian Express. It offers quite a robust critique of India's current foreign policy. And it's not just about, listing events, but digging into the why behind them and what that tells us about perception on the global stage.
Absolutely. And what's really fascinating, I think, is how this article challenges some of the conventional thinking. That's just crucial for understanding the nuances, the complexities of international relations. So our mission today is basically to dissect this perspective thoroughly. We want to make sure you grasp not just the what, but really the why it matters. Especially for our UPSC aspirants, this kind of critical take is gold for mains current affairs, potentially prelims too. And, well, for any informed citizen, really, it helps build a more complete picture of India's role in the world.
Okay, so let's dive in. The core argument right at the start, it's pretty stark. The article claims Indian foreign policy is in a, quote, deep morass. And it suggests this is often obscured, maybe even hidden, by what it calls hyper-nationalism and too much focus on tactical stuff or image management.
Tactical matters, yes.
But the root cause, according to the author, is something deeper.
Yeah.
A refusal of true realism.
Right. And connecting that to the bigger picture, the article emphasizes this isn't about, just being negative or self-deprecating.
No.
It's about achieving a genuinely clear-eyed analysis. The piece actually explains this true realism by drawing on advice from a former foreign secretary, Jagat Mehta. His point was, to really understand a situation, you have to sort of mentally remove the proper names, even your own country's name.
Interesting.
Yeah, to get ruthless objectivity, to imagine how you actually appear to your, quote, toughest adversaries. It forces that outside-in perspective, which can be uncomfortable, but, well, necessary for realism.
So the implication is that maybe the biggest hurdle isn't external pressure, but an internal issue, almost a kind of self-deception. How does this refusal of realism, as the article puts it, actually play out in specific situations?
Precisely. That's the core point. The article uses India's experience after Operation Sindoor as a key example. The period after certain counterterrorism actions. It describes India feeling somewhat shocked afterwards.
Shocked? Why?
Shocked at losing the diplomatic high ground, finding that, yes, we got the sort of standard boilerplate costless condemnations of terrorism, but also feeling like no one stands with us. It points out this really sharp contrast between India's own narrative, the breathless, self-proclaimed triumphs, and what other countries, both North and South, were apparently actually saying behind our backs. So, well, a stark look at how self-perception and external perception can diverge.
That is quite a powerful observation. So, okay, the question then becomes why? Why was that moral distinction the one India was trying to make seemingly so much harder to convey than expected? What went wrong, diplomatically speaking?
Well, the article lays out 3 key reasons, and it's interesting how they sort of build on each other. The first one is maybe the most pointed. It suggests India itself muddied the waters. Now, the piece explicitly says it has no idea what we might actually be doing in Balochistan, but it highlights allegations. Allegations that India's security establishment was maybe bragging sotto voce or whispering about using the Balochistan situation against Pakistan. And the argument is that kind of talk, even if just whispers, confuses the issue. It muddies the waters about using proxies, about targeting based on religion. It really complicates your moral standing if you're seen or even suspected of doing something similar to what you condemn.
Right. That makes sense. It raises that consistency question immediately, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Hard to claim the high ground against proxy tactics if you're perceived, even slightly, as engaging in them yourself. Okay, what's the second reason?
The second is about how the rest of the world tends to connect things. Violence in Balochistan, violence in Kashmir. For many outside observers, these get linked in a chain of associations. They don't necessarily see them in the neat, separate boxes that India might prefer. It's just perceived as regional instability.
A broader regional lens from the outside.
Exactly. And the third factor, according to the article, is crucial context. The backdrop of a government that, quote, does not exactly have a stellar reputation on moral condemnation of targeting people on account of their religion. Now, the piece asserts this makes it easier for the world to just dismiss incidents as one of those periodic South Asian things, a rather condescending view, the article argues, but one that we invited by perhaps not aligning our own actions consistently with our stated principles.
Wow. So pulling that thread, the message seems to be that maybe our own self-perception or our lack of confronting how others see us becomes a diplomatic liability. It inadvertently invites that kind of dismissal.
Yeah.
But the article doesn't stop with just these diplomatic situations, right?
Yeah.
It suggests this lack of realism bleeds into bigger anxieties, credibility, nuclear issues.
Yes, it connects directly to what the article calls an absolute loss of credibility, and it's quite alarming. It starts with the nuclear issue. It notes that while both India and Pakistan might feel they can manage escalation, control an escalatory ladder, the rest of the world is deeply worried about accidents, about things spiraling out of control.
The fear of the unintended consequence.
Precisely. The article even brings up Donald Trump's comments, suggesting his underlying concern wasn't just about the region, but about nuclear war making India and Pakistan a problem for the rest of the world. The implication is that this inherent nuclear risk overshadows other moral claims, regardless of who initiated what.
But couldn't one argue that national security sometimes necessitates actions that might look awkward diplomatically? That it's a tough balancing act? How does the article counter that? What other credibility issues does it raise?
It counters by suggesting this isn't just awkwardness, it's a comprehensive loss of moral standing. And it gives several examples. First, it looks at India's stance on the Ukraine war. The perception, it argues, was that India treated Russia's invasion as primarily their problem for Europe.
Okay.
The article then draws a parallel. If a major invasion is just their problem, then perhaps terrorism directed at India is also seen by others as not their problem. Their main concern, in that view, becomes the bigger risk, the risk of nuclear accidents. It shifts the focus from principles to just risk management.
That's a very stark, almost transactional way of framing it. What other examples are there of this alleged moral abdication?
Second, it points to India's relative silence on Gaza, described in the piece as what is now almost universally acknowledged as an ongoing genocide. The article argues this adds narcissism to the charge of moral abdication when India simultaneously focuses so intensely on its own concerns about terrorism. It suggests a selective moral outrage.
Selective outrage, okay.
Third, it's quite critical of operations targeting Khalistan activists abroad, specifically mentioning Canada and the U.S. It calls these meaningless operations against useless Khalistan activists, suggesting they were not only ineffective, but significantly botched our credibility as a state.
Damaging reputation without achieving much.
That's the argument. And finally, it points inwards. It argues that not allowing an open domestic discussion, even on the bare facts of the war, furthers our credibility crisis. The idea is that suppressing internal debate makes even India's truth seem less credible to the outside world.
So, the cumulative effect, as the article sees it, is that India's diplomats, even very able ones at the MEA, have a much harder job. Their moral arguments are met with, what was the phrase, at worst, a shrug.
Pretty much, yes, a sense of dismissal or indifference. But the article goes even deeper than these specific instances. It identifies another fundamental issue, what it calls the other disposition impeding clear thinking, India's whole approach to realism.
Ah, okay. So we talked about the refusal of true realism. Now we're talking about a flawed interpretation of realism.
Exactly. The article argues that the current establishment's version of realism isn't actual realism about the world as it is. Instead, it's framed as a simple inversion of some perceived past of Indian foreign policy. Meaning, it's more about reacting against perceived past mistakes, like non-alignment, perhaps, rather than objectively assessing the current global landscape.
In this supposed realism, what are its consequences, according to the article? Particularly thinking about, say, our neighborhood and maybe big power relations like with the U.S.?
Well, the consequences are painted as quite severe. This approach, with its alleged fantasies of transcending India's South Asian context, has apparently led to a spectacular misreading of the neighborhood. The direct result: losing influence, losing much of the neighborhood.
Losing the neighborhood, that's significant.
Very. And then there's the relationship with the U.S. This version of realism, the article claims, saw excessive courting of America as a sign of strength, of machismo. But the article flips that. It suggests this actually reveals a kind of domestic defeatism.
Defeatism? How so?
Because, the argument goes, it comes from those who never had confidence about building India's own strength domestically. Relying heavily on an external power reveals internal doubt.
That's quite a contrarian take on the U.S. relationship. So it's suggesting the motivations might be different from the official narrative.
Yeah.
And this reliance on America, the article seems skeptical about its benefits.
Deeply skeptical. The belief in the article calls this sheer fantasy that deals with the U.S. will be our salvation, that they'll magically fix domestic issues, catalyze domestic reform, secure us against China, boost our moral standing, or even help sort out neighborhood
It's
problems.
pure fantasy, it says.
Pure fantasy, according to the piece. And crucially, this focus prevents India from seeing the American project clearly, which the article defines as one of global dominance. And resisting or navigating that dominance, it concludes, will require a different toolkit altogether, a different approach than just close alignment.
That analysis really makes you think. It reminds me of that quote, I think, from a senior Chinese figure about leaders sometimes lying to the people and controlling information. But the crucial thing is, it is important they do not lie to themselves.
That quote perfectly captures the article's final punch on this point. It argues India's current lack of realism comes from the fact that our establishment has come to believe the lies it is trying to tell the people, which naturally raises a huge question. What are the long-term dangers of that kind of self-deception? For policy, for credibility, for navigating a really complex world.
We have covered a lot of ground today, really digging into this Indian Express piece. We looked at its core argument, foreign policy in a deep morass, stemming from a refusal of true realism. We discussed the diplomatic high ground issues, the alleged loss of credibility, nuclear fears, Ukraine, Gaza, those Khalistan operations, and finally, this critique of the current interpretation of realism itself, potentially leading to self-deception.
Absolutely. And it underscores why this kind of critical reading, considering different viewpoints, is just so vital, not just for policy wonks, but for anyone trying to understand complex global issues. Knowledge really gains value when it's understood critically and applied. And that critical lens is indispensable, especially for UPSC aspirants tackling current affairs. You need to see all sides.
So here's a thought to leave you with, building on the discussion. If, as this article strongly suggests, true realism demands we really confront how we appear, even to our toughest adversaries. What does that practically mean? How should India perhaps redefine its engagement, both with the world and maybe even with itself? It certainly challenges conventional thinking. We really hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and food for thought, not just for exam preparation, if that's your focus, but for being a more informed citizen in general. And hey, if you found this valuable, please do remember to like, subscribe, maybe leave us a comment, let us know if you have queries, or what other topics you'd like us to explore in a future deep dive. Your engagement really helps us keep these analyses coming. Thanks for joining us.